We see that, for instance, in the latest crises that have overcome humanity, the COVID-19 crisis, the effects of the war in Eastern Europe, and the Russian-Ukraine war. In both of these, the consequences of them have not seen that sense, that solidarity. We on the continent have been left alone to fend for ourselves. We saw that during the COVID-19 pandemic, when even access to vaccines became a major problem for the African continent. When people applied the principle of charity begins at home and looked after their own and were extremely reluctant to look outside their borders to assist those of us who did not have the preparations that we should have had to have the vaccines. So that's one clear example of the absence of solidarity. We've seen it again as a result of the war in Eastern Europe, the war in Ukraine, and its consequences, the dramatic impact that it has had on the global financial and economic system, and the extent to which so many people in Africa and in the so-called South have had to fend for themselves. So if indeed we're to have cooperation between the South and the North, the fundamental requirement of solidarity requires the political will. Is there the political will to reach out across the divide and try and create a new world whereby the them and us is no longer the paradigm?
He said institutions like the IMF should be positioned to bridge the gap between less endowed countries and more wealthy global players.
We're seeing in recent times, under the leadership of the current managing director of the IMF, a clear effort to reposition the IMF to look at the problems of its various constituent elements differently than it has in the past. And that attempt is bearing fruit. Is bearing fruit in the approaches and the manner in which they are. But I think we're going to have to go much further than an individual's particular impact on the institution, looking at how the institution itself can be reformed. Do we need to continue down the path of the IMF as the institution of last resort on the global scene? Is it possible for us now to look at the IMF as a mobilizer of capital for global development, whereby, because today we know that the vast wealth of the world is being held by people like Mr. Gates. It's the reality of the world which we live in today. The private sector, private capital, is many, many, many times superior in weight and quality to what is being held in the public sector. Our institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, should now be positioned to be a bridge for countries like my own to be able to reach these trillions of money that are being held in private hands, which we need to mobilize if indeed the problems of countries like my own countries in Africa are going to be able to find sustenance and sustainable development.